You know, in my view, first of all, we've had challenges in the evolution of the Nigerian economy. We just stop in one place and say, that is, we can bring in what has gone right or gone wrong during certain epochs. But we have to look at how our economy began to evolve. You know, in the colonial times, cash crops were introduced into the area that is now Nigeria. Most of the cash crops are on the tips of Nigeria. They came from cocoa or rubber or whatever. And we built a certain agri-produce-based economy that was doing very well in the 50s. The colonials failed to invest in industrialization of Nigeria, or Africa for that matter, generally speaking. These were outposts from which to extract raw materials for the metropole. Still, it allowed the marketing boards of the various regions, which is how we organized back in those days, to build up significant reserves in England. When self-government came, 56, 57, Nigerian ministers began to be appointed, there was a rapid rush to industrialize Nigeria. And the basis for that rush was a competition between the regions. Two American scholars called Prof. Elson and Howard Wolpe, in a book about modernization in Nigeria, referred to that phenomenon as competitive communalism, competing ethnic nationality groups, trying to see who would most bring progress to their people. And you saw how free education was considered a very important component of development, education. And the West went forward with free education. Zeke, when he went east from the West, tried to respond competitively, had his issues and challenges there because of the budget. He didn't make as much money as Western region, and how they overcame that through a certain philosophy that bred cooperation between the government, the communities, the missionaries, and all of that. All of these brought us into an era where very sadly, we had what I like to call a dangerous alchemy of soldiers and oil. Just as oil was becoming a major source of our revenues, soldiers took over power. What is peculiar about the military? Military is a command structure. Okay, so authority is dispersed, starting from the big general at the top to the colonels. So the big general at the top appoints a colonel to go and be a governor. He cannot question the general at the top. Whereas the Nigerian Economic Council under Balewa would have a meeting, and Prime Minister Balewa will make a presentation, and the premiers will say, we can't accept it. And they will fight for hours. One particular story I like to tell, Dr. Paul Kibo told me, he was an economic advisor to the Prime Minister. At the point they sent out the technocrats and said, look, any politicians sort this out. And after some time they were called back in, and Balewa announced, for example, that we're going to build a steel mill in every region, which struck Kibo was impossible. So after the meeting, he went, Mr. Prime Minister, and Balewa said to him, Dr. Akibo, the powerful premiers have had their say, we will have our way. Mr. Prime Minister, what will be our way? Dr. Akibo, we will do nothing. That's how Nigerian business today. Now, so this was the nature of what people refer to today as federalism. This competition between the regions, and the power is passed downwards. More the principle of subsidiarity, power was closer to the people. So when the military took over, a natural nature of military structure meant the centralization of authority. In that centralization of authority, oil producing revenues made your tax inconsequential for those who govern. In the civilian era before, everything was driven by taxes. You know, people like me who grew up, you know, here in Lagos, you know, Mushi was like the demarcation between the Western region and the Federal Territory. If you see they're chasing you for tax in the Western region, you will run and find a way of escaping into Mushi, and you're free and kind of, you know. The army didn't need to collect your tax anymore with oil revenues. So they didn't bother you with taxes, you didn't bother them with what they did with oil money. That was when the decline began in terms of economic planning and implementation. Yes, of course, there were some gains with revenues being pushed into massive infrastructure development and later. But the bottom line was that that structure of how decisions were made created a problem with how we manage the economy. Well, long and short of it, we got into a structural logjam, which it took the political sagacity, let's call it that, of a general Babangida to solve. I mean, people go after him for other things, but enough study has not been done of how his political cleverness saved the Nigerian economy. Because all our Marxist friends, all the university lecturers have to be Marxists to be taken on to be authentic. They talk the economy into a position where basically lines of credit were being shut down in Nigerian banks, like foreign banks. We couldn't pay due debts and stuff like that. We were in debt. It then took the work done under President Babangida to begin to create markets. One of the most important markets that were created was the foreign exchange market. It was not an easy thing. It went first to a two-tier foreign exchange market called Sphere. Then eventually it liberalized enough. And this market facilitated commerce. Now that was the foreign exchange market. Now we come to 2015 and we begin to play these funny games. The result is where the foreign exchange market is here today. So I think it's important to understand the place of institutions in economic performance. I would say that 90% of my academic work has been around institutions and economic performance. I wrote a book titled Managing Uncertainty, Competition and Strategy in Emerging Economies far back in the mid-90s. And the essential point of that is the nature of institutions and how they evolved. Of course, the biggest influence on my work was a gentleman called Douglas North, whose work on institutions and economic performance remains for me perhaps one of the best. Has been done even the Nobel Prize in economics, of course, for his work. What we do not seem to understand is that the things that happened in the early years of the Buhari administration regarding multiple exchange rates and all of that fractured the institution of markets. The consequence is what we're dealing with today. So I say this so that we can learn where the problems are coming from. It's not because this guy is a bad guy, that guy. They just did not understand enough what ultimately the consequence would be of that conduct. Let us come home to us.
Talking about the exchange rate, if you look at that, the naira to the dollar, it's in recent times, it's been mind-boggling. If you were to advise the CBA governor and other leaders of the economy, what would be your recommendations?
Well, this is the point I've already just made about markets. We've already fractured the market. But the most important thing is that economic performance is a function of production. In Nigeria, we don't produce. The incentive structure is so warped that those who have the most money are not those who produce. And economics is a science of incentives. So there's no incentive to produce. You will do better becoming a good friend of a powerful person, and one day some piece of people will pass in front of you and you will buy a private jet. You go and start to do some of the things I've been trying to do set up an integrated agricultural. First of all, the banks won't lend you money because the Nigerian banking system is not oriented to production, it's oriented to rent extraction. Okay. Then you get to a point where there isn't enough production such that if anything, any small thing that happens to oil prices, we all begin to run helter-skelter. And this is even more troubling because we are in an energy transition period. 20 years from now, crude oil will constitute something marginal in international energy equation. How are we going to function there when we not diversify the base of this economy? So we need a national strategy for economic growth, for driving up production. The orientation is still through too much rent. And because of state capture, the powerful people will gather share the thing that is supposed to be used to support new entrepreneurs emerging. I shouldn't say this, but I was talking to a very powerful person in the financial system, and he says, look, a very good friend of mine, by the way, it's not about you. You see, if you were the banks will be running after you to give you money for anything you think of. And it occurred to me that he did not understand economics. And these are top people running the economy. He didn't understand economics. Because, you see, the banks in doing that essentially are ensuring this economy will grow. What leads to economic growth is creative destruction. Finding those young, new entrepreneurs who will overthrow today's dominant capitalists. In fact, two of my favorite scholars in this regard, Raghuram Rajan and Luigi Zingales from the University of Chicago. Rajan was the chief economist at the IMF and Reserve Bank of India, governor of the Reserve Bank of India. And they argue in a book that is appropriately titled Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists, that the most dangerous people to capitalist advance are today's dominant capitalists. Because it's their interest to suppress progress so that they can stay dominant. And the way that capitalism has made progress is by some young boy who has a new idea that dethrones their own idea, having access to resources to enable him create greater value. This is why if you look at dominant companies, look at the United States, one of the most regenerative economies in human history. You will find, for example, in 1961, Thomas Watson Sr., chief executive of IBM, I was speaking to American business leaders. I said to them, by the way, how many of you can guess the number of companies that were in the top 100 61 years ago in 1900 are still there? But it turned out only 3. Percentage was 3 in 61 years. Only 3 that were in the top 100 were still there. Because the system creatively destroys. In Europe, even, it's much, much different. And then it gets worse when it comes to countries like Nigeria. 1, 2, 3 dominant capitalists will be there forever until they die and their business fails or something. An economy can't grow like that. You can find a way of stimulating those young entrepreneurs to destroy today's value and create greater value. So you see, many people who run the country don't understand economics. They are in serious trouble. And that's where Nigeria is.
Looking at the debt profile, it's running to over 33 trillion naira. And the president is seeking another loan to about $4 billion. Do you consider this to be a necessary move and a wise decision for that?
You see, everything has to have context. I'm not one who fears the idea of borrowing of its own. It's a matter of targeting. It's a matter of what you're borrowing to do. If that would ramp up production, if that would facilitate commerce in a way that would create new value from which you can amortize and have much more left over. I have no problem with any borrowing. But I don't see a game plan that suggests that that is going to happen with money that are being borrowed. And so I'm extremely worried, frightened almost. Because you see, politicians in our part of the world, I'll be very honest and use language not to. The combination of ignorance and indifference about people will make them zealots. Tomorrow you worry about it, and then I'm gone. I think this is dangerous. This is why we must have civil society that is strong. And if you don't have civil society that can stop irresponsible politics, tomorrow will be a very dangerous place to be. And so, I can listen to a partisan who says, no, see, all people behind before did not do infrastructure. Now we're about to do all the infrastructure. Where were you for 6 years and suddenly you want to do all the infrastructure? In a normal democracy, I didn't hear it's not a democracy, of course, with all the coup that means elections. Once you are approaching lame dog status, there are some things you must not try to do. The Buhari government is a lame dog. Let us be honest with ourselves. It has less than 2 years to go. It must not be able to take a decision that is binding on the future of the Nigerian people without a substantial pushback from civil society. Okay? So there are things we must pay attention to. Not because you like or do not like the incumbent. It's just the logic of democratic order. In the United States, once elections are taking place, an incumbent president, even though he is within his right, when he is civil, cannot even make any significant decision without consulting the incoming president. We don't have an incumbent now in Nigeria, but we're close enough to a time of choice that incumbents should not, and I'm talking about just Buhari, I'm talking about for all of history, that's the way we should act. So we need people who have a big heart for Nigeria, and not people who are looking at their moment to be able to get this